Where's this end? Cameron's shed. Absolutely ludicrous. So that shows you what an acceptance. And I actually...
Right, okay.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming along here today. I do apologise for having kept you waiting because of the joys of the British motorway system. Roger is trying to get down here within legal limits, I'm sure. So I hope he'll be joining you later. Just before I introduce our speaker, Lindsay, here, I just want to mention a couple of things about what we've been doing this weekend at this Lib Dem conference. We don't normally attend a Lib Dem conference, but we thought it would be appropriate to remind the Lib Dems and to support their policy of having a referendum on EU membership. That's not the constitution we're talking about, the Lisbon Treaty, the Renan Constitution, but actually an in-out vote. Now, it has to be said, the Lib Dem reasons for supporting this leave a great deal to be desired. I think it was a cynical ploy initially to avoid a referendum on the EU Constitution. That's whatever their motives were. I think what they've ended up with is a sensible policy, actually, and so we wanted to let it be known that we in the Better Off Out campaign, the Freedom Association, do come on, Idris, that we in the Better Off Out campaign, the Freedom Association, do support that Lib Dem policy of holding a referendum on EU membership, and we hope that that will be taken up by some of the other parties as well. Now, we had a sort of mini referendum on the front by Bournemouth Pier. We weren't trying to pretend that this was in any way representative, because it's a very small sample. It really was just to raise the issue of having an in-out referendum. And obviously, in terms of having a representative sample, given that we held this polling booth, and it was done very correctly, I have to say. It was done just like a polling booth. There was no Better Off Out banners or literature or anything, no anti-EU stuff around. It was almost exactly like a proper polling booth, and we left people to make their own decisions. But obviously, the fact that there were 1,000 or more Lib Dem delegates in town passing this place meant obviously we were going to get a much more pro-EU result than we would in any other day in any other town. But given that, despite all of that, we did actually get a result of 72% in favour of leaving the EU. Our question, so I think it would have been better still. I beg your pardon, I got that wrong. 78%. I do apologise. 78% voted yes. That was that Britain would be better off out of the EU, and 22% voted no, that Britain would be better in the EU. And we deliberately actually did it in that positive way to get a yes vote, because that's what Better Off Out is about. We're not attacking Europe, we don't dislike the Europeans, we simply think that this country would be better off, would have a brighter future outside the EU, trading with the rest of the world and of course with the EU countries as well. But back in control of our destiny, a free and independent country again. So we were very pleased with that, those figures, and we will now be taking this on. This is just the start of these referendums we're going to be holding around the country. We'll be continuing this at the Conservative Party conference at our Freedom Zone there, and at future events after that. Now that's enough from me. And I now just would like to introduce Lindsay, who is who's the director, I have to say on director, of Better Off Out, and we're absolutely delighted to have her as director. Lindsay is a most distinguished author. She's written some excellent books on the EU. She also has a great deal of experience both in the private and public sectors. Without any further ado, Lindsay, over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Well, good afternoon. In fact, I was delighted to hear the result of that referendum. Simon's been very clever and hasn't mentioned it at all, kept secret. So perhaps our job is nearly over, dare we think. There is a well-known Chinese curse, at least it purports to be Chinese. May you live in interesting times. And we certainly seem to be doing that. Yesterday, of course, was one of the most horrendous days on the stock markets. I'm an ex-investment banker, I hasten to say. It was one of the most horrendous days ever. And even I, watching the screens at home, feel rather shell-shocked still. And of course, Alan Greenspan, the former head of the US Federal Reserve Bank, has got another way of putting it. He doesn't say, may you live in interesting times, but he did say that this is a once-in-a-50-year event, and then he quickly said, well, maybe it's a once-in-a-100-year event. So we're certainly in the territory that none of us have been in before. And it's certainly a time, I think, when most of us feel that we should look at our balance sheets, we should check our bank accounts, we should indeed check our very banks. How can we protect ourselves and take care of the fundamentals, financial and in everything else? And in the midst of this financial maelstrom, which will of course affect the whole world economy, it looks as though the Liberal Democrats, meeting just up the road here, seem to be doing just that they're taking a fundamental view. And we in the Freedom Association, and of course in the Better Off Out campaign, part of the Freedom Association, strongly support them in taking a fundamental view. We are, after all, a truly cross-party group, and wherever we find people and their leaders prepared to take a long, hard look, in this case at the European Union, as Nick Clegg and his team seem to be doing, then of course we're delighted. Now what Nick Clegg has said he wants to do is hold a referendum on what he calls the fundamental question of our day, British membership of the European Union. And the real issue, as Nick Clegg has rightly identified, isn't the Lisbon Treaty, the Constitution, which is of course exactly the same thing. The real issue is should we or should we not remain members of the European Union, an ultimate in or out referendum. And Nick Clegg is quite right to say to both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, join with me in calling for such a referendum that will settle Britain's European future once and for all, an in-out referendum. Vince Cable followed that up by announcing that the Liberal Democrats have dropped what has been a long-standing commitment in their manifestos, saying it's pointless to hold a referendum on entry into the euro as it is perfectly obvious that such a referendum could never be won. Cable says handing over control of interest rates to the European Central Bank may have contributed to property price bubbles in some Eurozone countries. Well, he's absolutely right there. I don't think it's a may, it's a dead certain that it has, including countries like Spain, which of course are heading down the tubes very fast. How right he is. And in a sense it gets better because Mr. Cable went on to say that the Liberal Democrats will campaign in the next election for a more decentralised, less bureaucratic European Union. And he said there are things wrong with the EU. Great, the common agricultural policy, he said, is a complete disgrace. So the Liberal Democrats are apparently going to campaign to cut quangos, well there are plenty of those, most of them are linked to the European Union in some way or other, devolve funding to democratic institutions, wonderful, expose unaccountable regional bodies for what they are. Well, I've written a whole book about that, I know very well how unaccountable those regional bodies are, and call on local government to take more responsibility. So all of that sounds absolutely wonderful. So why are the Liberal Democrats taking what I would regard as a common sense approach? Well, it isn't anything, of course, to do with the turmoil in the financial markets, but they say it is a belief in freedom of the individual. Now, I don't know the detail of what's been going on today up the road in the conference, But I would guess there are still, despite our referendum over the last day or so, that there are a significant number of Liberal Democrat members who don't want to leave the European Union. That's been the stance for a very long time. Despite Clegg's views on the euro, Vince Cable's views on the euro, and the call for an in-out referendum to end all referendums. Nonetheless, Nick Clegg is still truly pro-Europe. And he justifies it in this way. He says, Liberals believe in the importance of individual rights, that we can trace the roots of a belief in a higher justice transcending the interests of the individual nation state. He says, that's why I'll always be a passionate promoter of the European Union and of Britain's place at its heart. Well, I don't quite get it, but he obviously does, so we'll take that one as read. But let me say to those like Nick Clegg who want Britain to be at the heart of the European Union that it cannot be equated with a belief in individual freedom, which is his avowed reason for promoting it. And I'm just going to cite one case, and that one case has been in the press recently, which is trials which can be held in absentia. That is, without the presence of the accused, maybe without the accused even knowing that they're on trial. And self-evidently in that situation there can be no defence. Now how on earth can Nick Clegg or anybody else justify that? The UK Attorney General has tried to do so. He has said that this trials in absentia will stop people who are avoiding trials from doing so. Well, yes, and there's an awful lot of buts that would follow that. And unfortunately, there's very strong support from EU governments, including our own, who was one of the 6 governments to promote it in the first place, which is outrageous, and from members of the European Parliament. Not, I'm happy to say, Roger Helmer and many of his colleagues, but from a majority in the European Parliament. The Parliament actually put out a statement that says the EU wants to create a common area for justice, which requires the mutual recognition of criminal law judgments by member states. This is just one brick of many bricks in this building block towards one law for the whole of the European Union. Now, of course, you already know we have the EU arrest warrant. That's been going for nearly 4 years. So if you're found guilty in Romania, in Greece, in Italy, in Spain, as people already have been, then with the EU arrest warrant, that's it. You are extradited immediately, and there is very little between you and the clanging of the jail door. Just a few tick boxes. There is no actual protection in law. And it's very small comfort if you're the accused and the condemned to know that you can still appeal. Once you're in jail in that country, you can appeal to a court in that country, not Britain. And only from behind bars. There is no bail. And if you try to organise a defence from behind bars, that is extremely difficult and in a foreign country. It beggars belief that the British government proposed this and supported it. It is so awful, it is quite literally jaw-dropping. Lawyers across Europe have lambasted this move to ever closer union, and this is all part of it. Lawyers in general do understand what it means, and there are plenty of voices again, but nonetheless, it's happening. Now, trials in absentia are just the latest staging post of very many for us on a 35-year journey so far towards that ever closer union that's in the preamble of the Treaty of Rome. We began, you'll remember, with trade, at least that's what they said it was, free trade, and we British love free trade, so we bought that one, hook, line and sinker, but it wasn't free trade, it was a customs union with strings attached and plenty of small print. And that small print has been running for those 35 years at astronomical costs that no British government will review. And I could go on about all the staging posts since we joined in January 1973, but it will be the time taken to read 32 miles of paper on which those regulations are written. 32 miles of paper so far, almost a mile of paper for every year we've been in the European Union. Well, if the EU has got as far as creating one judicial system, and it's not completed yet, but it's well down the road, trial in your absence is just a part of that, what's left to do, and how close are we to the ultimate aim of one state, one country? And I have to say, we are very close indeed. I've always understood that it was 2010, and we're 2008, 2 years to go. Until that's it, we are in one country and it's not called Britain. And the two big areas that they have still to tackle are policing and defence. So it won't be a British police officer who will knock on your front door or even break it down to take you away to serve a prison sentence in another part of the European Union, but a Europol officer. Europol, of course, has existed since 1992. But it's getting bigger and it's getting more powers, and it will be the police force for the whole of the European Union. Well, what can save us? Can anything save us? Well, a referendum could, for one. And if, as Vince Cable says, the British people would say no to the euro, and I'm sure they would, and our referendum suggests, and other referendums suggest, that there's a very good chance the British people will say no to being in the EU at all. That is the one thing that can save us. And so I applaud the Liberal Democrats for taking this line, even if the reasoning leaves me gasping a bit and the logic is illogical. But with all the sounds of doors clanging shut, doors mark freedom, doors mark liberty, we don't have very much time. So roll on Nick Clegg's referendum. Congratulations to the Liberal Democrats. Thank you.
A second vote before the European elections, and in a situation where the Conservatives still seem to be totally confused about what they will do in the future, what positive action do you think the Conservatives can do to change the European Union treaties when in practice it'll all be finalised before they come to power?
Well, just before Roger actually comes in the room, because I don't want to embarrass him, I think the best thing the Conservative Party can do is change their leader. Because I don't think under David Cameron they're going to do anything that is positive. I think it's going to be a series of fudges, by which time it's too late. I think what they have to do is stand up and say we are opposed to the European Union and we're going to get out. And unless you do that, that's it.
Absolutely.
On that note, do you want to take a seat?
Well, it's really good. I didn't hear your earlier remarks, so lovely to see you.
Great. Welcome.
Thank you.
Just welcome Roger on board. I'm sure most of you know Roger Helmer, and as well as being an MEP and an enthusiastic driver, despite the British traffic. Roger is, of course, chairman of the Freedom Association and one of the first signatories to our Better Off Out campaign. So great to see you, Roger. Just to let you know, so Lindsay's done her bit. We're doing some questions now. So if you'd like to join in the answering the questions as well, and then you do your bit, if that's all right with you.
Well, I should have said all I had to say.
Right. Sorry. Yes.
I mean, I've never had a chance to vote on any European issues, but if there was, say there was a referendum...
You're too young.
Well, only just. Say there was a referendum, an in or out referendum in 2010, wouldn't it be the case, as it was in the 70s, you've got three major parties
Yes.
that would support staying in,
Yes.
some of the media. Do you think the British public is really... Do you think the argument is really won? Because if it you know...
I think
As of
one may
now.
be the wrong word. We're winning.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
you know, if there is a referendum and the British public vote to stay in, then that's
What I
going to be
would
it for another
hope is
generation.
that we don't have a referendum, that we actually can elect a government that has this in its manifesto, because we're not fudging around.
No.
It's quite clear cut. Roger.
Can I comment on it? It's pretty well known from opinion polling. If you just have a referendum that says, do you wish to be in or out, you will almost certainly get a majority for staying in. If, however, you're allowed to construct a sensible question,
Yes.
you see, if Gordon Brown were designing the question, it would say, do you wish to remain a member of the European club, or would you prefer to be isolated and marginalised? In which case, I can promise you the majority would vote to remain members of the European club. If I asked the question, I would say, do you want full political union controlled by Brussels, or would you like a looser relationship based on free trade and voluntary cooperation? If you ask that question, I guarantee that you will get a looser arrangement. Now, we all know that if you go to the European Commission and describe what I call a looser arrangement based on free trade, they will say, well, you're leaving. And if I were doing the negotiations, I'd say, well, if you want to see it like that, fine. But I think it all depends on how you ask the question. There's some very good research by Global Vision that shows there's a sort of, very roughly, there's, if you like, a hardcore of a quarter who would say out on any terms. There's a hardcore at the other end who would say in on any terms, including Nick Clegg. And there's 50% in the middle who would say we're unhappy with the way it's going, we'd like a looser relationship. So we have to find a way of bringing those 50% in with the 25%, and then we've got a majority. If I may comment, what you're talking about, Idris, to a great extent is things that might happen in the future. I mean, you are right, it could be that we would vote to stay in the European Union, and sometime around 2050, a new generation, our grandchildren, will be up on the hind legs saying, it may have been all right in 2008, but it's certainly not all right in 2050, we want out. Just as if we were having this debate in 1960, and I said to you we should plan on the basis of the USSR breaking up, you'd probably think I was nuts. But was it 87 it did break up? Or 89, I forget now, remind me somebody. So these things will change, but I think, for our practical purposes, my engagement in politics is unlikely to last beyond 5 or 10 years, so I'm interested in that period, and the next general election will happen well within that period, and so I think we've got to work out what we're going to do then. We can't speculate about what might happen in 2050. Then your second point, which is also the future but on a shorter time scale, and that is, couldn't we swing people during the course of a campaign? Perhaps we could, but bear in mind that you would have major political forces, large parts of the media ranged against us. We might win. But I come back to what I assume was Lindsay's point, I didn't actually quite hear it, that if we gambled everything on an in-out debate in very stark terms, and if, as I suspect, people voted 60-40 to stay in, certainly as far as you and I are concerned, that's the end of it.
But can I offer some hope? Because I actually agree with you.
I'm hopeful.
Is the upset in the markets that we see going on crumbling. I mean, it could be very nasty. I think Norman Tebbit's always thought it could be very nasty, that there would be civil unrest, shall we put it politely. But I can certainly see that coming, probably within the next year or so.
What I would add to that is, thank God we never joined.
Yes.
Because if you look at a country like Italy, Italy is absolutely being crucified by relative labour competitiveness and labour costs between Italy and, say, Germany. So Italy is having a terrible time. And you might say, well, in that case, the solution's easy. Let them come out. But I tell you what, if they come out and invent a new lira, the first thing that will happen is that the value of the new lira will drop by 40% compared to the euro, but all their debts are in euros. So suddenly they'll be increasing their debt by 40 over 60, which is 2/3.
Unless they write them off.
Well, unless they default.
Yes, very good.
I mean, it's not. We shouldn't just go around saying, well, Italy can always leave, easy thing. Why don't they just solve their problem? The problems of staying in are very serious for a country like Italy, and the problems of getting out are very serious. So I never cease to thank heaven that we actually managed to stay out.
Any other questions?
As an investment banker, I just wondered if our savings are slightly safer in a building society rather than in a bank at the moment.
Well, they're effectively the same thing, and yes, they are. Yes, you'll be bailed out. But in other instruments, probably not.
Up to 35 grand.
And a post office.
Yeah.
So So it'd be the same as a bank, would it, the building society?
Yes.
You can answer a question for me on that. If you have an offset mortgage,
Yes.
so that you do have, and you perhaps have a deposit account. Suppose you had let's take for the sake of argument, you had a £50,000 mortgage, but it was on an offset basis, and you had £50,000 of deposits. If they went bankrupt, would you say, well, effectively I've got nothing, so I'm well within the £35,000, or would the government come to you and say, we only guarantee the £50,000, you can whistle for the other 15?
I suspect the latter. Is that your situation? I mean, when I say I'm a banker, I'm not a high street banker. I was an investment banker covering the world pharmaceutical industry. So
Not that separate.
I'm going to add to that from personal experience. I was once on the committee of inspection of a bankrupt company that owed me money. And the legal position is that the liquidators are entirely justified in law in demanding all of the money that a debtor owes to the bankrupt company, even disregarding what the bankrupt company
owes
might
to the
owe to
debtor.
other people.
Thank you, I've learned something important.
Very Stuart. With the changes in the rules for the Euro political parties, will Conservatives be able to set up a new party and escape from the DPP as Cameron has promised?
Let me just clarify that, because it is so complicated and the terminology is so messy. I think you mean a political group in the Parliament.
Yeah.
You do, good. The answer is, we believe we can, but you know, I hear the voices of those who tell me that David Cameron promised it immediately and didn't do it, and that he later promised it in a week or so and didn't do it, and that he later promised it in months, not years, and didn't do it, and he is now promising it by effectively the middle of next year. And I know, I can tell you there is work going on. I can't, for a variety of reasons. One, I don't know, and two, it would be technically unwise give you a detailed breakdown of what the work is. But I know that amongst those of my colleagues who are involved in it, we believe it can be done, and therefore we are hoping that this time David Cameron will actually fulfil the commitment that he's made and do it. You have to recognise that there are a load of people, both within the party and outside the party, who are militating against it, not least Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy and Commission President Barroso, and all these guys. So, yes, I mean, and I and my colleagues are arguing very strongly that it should happen.
I'll follow on from that one, Roger. You and Dan Hannan are already out of the EPP. After the next Euro elections, will that state continue for you two?
2 down and 25 to go. Only after the election we'll probably have more than 27. Yes, well, we've all signed a piece of paper, which is rather amusing actually, because it's a sort of mutually contradictory piece of paper. And what it actually says is, we will follow the direction of the leader of the party and leave the EPP. And it then says, and we will then join whatever political party, whatever political group in the Parliament the party decides to join. And the question has arisen by the bad guys who want to stay in the EPP. Oh well, they say, yes of course, well the leader could just decide to rejoin the EPP. My position is, well, I signed a piece of paper saying I will follow the leader's decision to leave, and I stand by it. So that's the position at the moment. But no, I don't think in practical terms Cameron can actually, after the European elections, say, well, I thought about it carefully and I promised it several times and I promised it again, but this time, no, I'm not going to bother. I think that would be very demeaning for the party and the leader of the party, and I think my personal view is he will do it.
Roger, I know it's an unusual way to get around having the questions before the speech, but would it be alright if I call on you to speak now?
Yes.
Then,
if I can I perhaps ask a question? Are there any Liberal Democrats in the room?
There you go.
Okay, well, would you like me to hold forth briefly?
Yeah.
May I?
Absolutely. Roger needs very little introduction, but so we're very proud to have him as our chairman. They've gone to great length, the pro-EU crowd have gone to great lengths to prevent him coming this meeting. First to set fire to the Channel Tunnel, and they've been trying to blow up bridges as well. But Roger, over to you.
Well, it got worse than that actually, Simon. Thank you for the introduction. Mine out of Brussels, which should just have done the business. First of all, the flight was delayed for half an hour, and then junction 9 to junction 10 on the M40 was shut, and I had to go through Woodstock and odd little places. But I did finally arrive before 1 o'clock, so I thought that was quite an achievement. Now, what I wanted to start by doing, actually, was I wanted to start by congratulating the Liberal Democrats on junking their obsessive commitment to everything to do with Brussels and the European Union. And as there aren't any Liberal Democrats here, it rather reduces the point of my doing so. I do think it's remarkable. And I think that, in fact, it's good political tactics. Some of you come from the southwest, and you'll be very well aware that the good folk of the southwest seem to be more Eurosceptic on the whole than the rest of the country. And I think that 1 or 2 Liberal seats in the southwest will be greatly at risk if they go on with their absolute commitment to the European Union. There's apparently blind enthusiasm for it. And the fact that even Nick Clegg has been prepared to at least tone down the rhetoric a little bit, I think is encouraging. We were talking earlier on about whether we were winning the argument. And who knows, perhaps we are. It is not only, however, good political tactics for the Liberal Democrats. I would argue that it is simply common sense. Now, I'm going to carry on as if I had a Liberal Democrat audience here and make a few remarks that actually do bear repeating. Because if you start talking to pro-Europeans and leftists and people of that kind, and you admit that you're actually a Eurosceptic, they immediately jump to a sort of stereotype conclusion. If you're a Eurosceptic, you're a little Englander, you are xenophobic, you hate foreigners, you're an isolationist, you want to blow up the Channel Tunnel. I don't need to blow up the Channel Tunnel, it was already done, as Simon remarked last week. I have to tell you that in my case, and I think in the case of most Eurosceptics that I know, absolutely nothing could be further from the truth. I personally regard Britain, and I think most Eurosceptics do, as a great global trading nation. That is our lifeblood, that is what we do. And before I got into politics in 1999, I had a proper job for more than 30 years. And my proper job with a number of major companies was always in international business, and about 12 years of my career actually was spent living, resident, running businesses not only outside Britain but outside the EU, mainly in East and Southeast Asia, and I've worked a bit in America and so on. So I regard myself as a very strong internationalist, and I'm in favour of international cooperation and international trade. But I rather sympathise with the slogan of the Norwegian No campaign. You recall that the Norwegians were fully expected to join the European Union at much the same time as Sweden did. And at the last minute they had a referendum, and the wise Norwegians voted no, because they seemed to want to keep their hands on their oil and their fish, which when you think about it was quite a smart move. And the slogan of the No campaign in Norway was quite simply this: it was "Europe is too small for us." And that is exactly the case. We are, as I say, a global trading nation, and to link ourselves uniquely or primarily or even preferentially to one local area defined merely by geography, you have to say, well, why? There is no sense in doing it. There is no sense in if we said we will primarily trade with America and everybody else can be also rans, people say, what are you thinking of? But we apparently are prepared to say we will primarily make European nations our trading partners, and therefore to an extent disadvantage the rest of the world. Actually disadvantage the rest of the world considerably, because the European Union, which now sets our trade policy, I mean for the last 30 years we haven't had a trade policy. The European Union in Brussels sets our trade policy. They have set up trade deals with countries all around the world, and I've written about this at some length. They have been favourable towards countries which are former colonies of continental European countries, and they have been less favourable to countries like America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, India. Strange, isn't it? They're finally catching up with 1 or 2 of those, but we have definitely had the Commonwealth in a backseat position in terms of trading policy. The other thing is not just shall we choose this bit of the world or that bit of the world. Some bits of the world are doing better than others. And a number of major organisations, including the European Commission itself, and the OECD and the United Nations have done studies of patterns of global trade over the next 3 or 4 decades. And the sort of predictions they are making are quite striking. America will, broadly speaking, hold its share of world trade over the next 3 or 4 decades. Countries like China and India will substantially increase their share of world trade over the next few decades. And guess what? Europe's share will virtually halve. Now, that's very sad for Europe. But why would we choose to link ourselves preferentially to the one area of the world that is going to do relatively much worse than many other areas we could be trading with? I'm not saying we shouldn't trade with Europe. Of course we should trade with Europe. But we shouldn't set up deals that focus our minds on Europe at the expense of the rest of the world. And Europe, of course, is fearfully protectionist. Now, again, I'm a believer in free trade. Europe is scraping the barrel at the moment to find every possible excuse to be protectionist. They dress it up in other clothes. The Green Movement has given them a wonderful opportunity. If we put in place wonderful controls on carbon emissions, we make ourselves wonderfully green in Europe, how can we then import goods from countries with lower environmental standards that haven't done all that we've done to protect the climate? And we can have another meeting about climate. We'll leave that one on one side for the moment. When we have high standards and high wages and high labour standards and health and safety and all those good things, how can we import products from countries where they have lower standards? The International Labour Organization wants higher standards. Every one of these ploys is a device to enable Europe to protect itself against foreign competitors. And of course, if you look at the Common Agricultural Policy, it is nothing but a vast protection scheme. I get so frustrated with the bien-pensant liberals who think, I'm sorry there aren't any here, liberals who think it's a terribly good thing to eat fair trade, to drink fair trade coffee. Actually, if they want to do something for farmers in the third world, forget about fair trade coffee, just dismantle the Common Agricultural Policy. That would be the first way to start. My good colleague Daniel Hannan, whose name has already been mentioned today, has said that the European Union is making us poorer and less democratic and less free. And I often quote Dan because he often puts things much more succinctly and cogently than I'm able to do myself. And I think that sums it up in a nutshell. If you look at prosperity, people say, I hear all sorts of people saying, well, look at the trade we get in the European Union. Look how much better it is now. Look how much richer we are than we were 40 years ago. But if you go to any part of the developed world, you go to America, they're much richer than they were 40 years ago. You go to Shanghai, they're much richer than they were 40 years ago. So it's a bit difficult to say, well, it's uniquely in Europe because we formed the European Union that we're richer than we were 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. And of course we do benefit from trade. There is no question that we are better off trading in Europe without tariff barriers and with arrangements to allow the free movement of goods than we would be if we had national boundaries and national customs tariffs in 27 different countries. Nobody can argue with that. But you can
I will.
Well, thank you very much, but you'd be wrong. You can quantify the benefits, and don't take my word for it. Take the word of the European Commission for once. The word of Peter Mandelson. Because they've made various estimates, but they all come out about 1.8% of GDP, that we are better off because of the benefits of trade. However, there are also economic disadvantages in being a member of the European Union, and here again, I love to quote the Commissioner, because if I told you what I thought the disbenefits were, you might say I was exaggerating, but you're hardly going to accuse the Commissioner of exaggerating. And Commissioner Günther Verheugen, whom I'm sure you all mention over breakfast every day, is a Vice President of the European Commission responsible for industry and enterprise. And I love to tell this story. He's the one who was fingered in the German newspaper for going away with his chief of staff. And they were seen on holiday in a European seaside resort, hand in hand. I have to say, his chief of staff is a woman, so it's not perhaps quite so bad as you thought. But what is really touching is that, according to the newspaper reports I read, she's also the lady who signs off Mr. Verheugen's expenses. So you see, the way of doing business in Europe is still alive and well. But he actually did a calculation, not a back-of-the-envelope estimate, but he had his staff going away and doing it thoroughly and working out the methodology to work out how much European regulation is costing European industry. Because everybody agrees that we have too much regulation, it's a bit expensive, but fair enough, the Commission wanted to quantify it. And the answer they came out with was about 600 billion euros a year. And by the way, that 1.8% of trade benefit is about 160 billion euros a year. In other words, the costs, simply on that basis, the costs of regulation against the benefits of trade in the single market, the costs outweigh the benefits by a factor of about 3. Of course, as I'm sure Idris is about to point out, there are loads of other costs that I haven't mentioned. There's the cost of the common agricultural policy. There's the cost of all these European programs that we know waste vast amounts of money. We have our net contributions to the European project, which by coincidence are just about the same as the admitted level of waste and fraud in the European institutions. So I hope I've made the point. You cannot justify the argument that the European Union is about prosperity. The costs today far outweigh any economic benefits we get out of it. Now, Dan said it's making us poorer. He also said it's making us less democratic. And judging by the faces in front of me, I don't think I need to spend a lot of time convincing you of that. But just think how monstrous is their contempt for public opinion. I'm tired to death of hearing European apparatchiks like the President of the European Parliament telling me that we have a European Union which is based on democracy and the rule of law, a union of values. Well, democracy and the rule of law. Under their own rule of law, the European Constitution was dead unless it was ratified by all member states. It wasn't ratified by all member states, so it ought to be dead. What did they do? They came back, jigged around a few of the clauses, detached them from the original document, so it was difficult to read sequentially. Don't take my word for it. That's what Valéry Giscard d'Estaing says, and he ought to know, because he wrote it. He was the convention, so-called, that originally wrote it. And they then thought, well, that's fine. Nobody will notice that it's actually the same as the Constitution, and we've had Gordon Brown doing their dirty work for them by going around and telling us, well, no, it's quite different, doesn't need a referendum on this. And they thought they'd get away with it, but for little old Ireland, and thank God for the Irish, don't mind the Welsh, thank God for the Irish. Nobody believed the Irish would vote no, and even if you remember the day of the referendum, people were saying, well, if it's a very low turnout, it could just go no, but provided the turnout's over 40%, we'll be all right. And of course, as you recall, the turnout was well over 50%, but they voted no.
And they were mostly young people from
they were, yes, oh yes, yes. This myth that, well, there are some old people who are a bit reluctant about European integration. All these young people, they love backpacking around Eastern Europe, it's all great and they're really up with it. No, they're not. It is the young people who have the self-confidence not to feel the need for being attached to an anti-democratic European structure. And the more I look at the way they're doing it, the determination now to overturn the Irish vote, and you remember as well as I do how often they've done it. The Danes voted against Maastricht and had to go away and vote again. The Irish voted against Nice. The French and the Dutch voted against the Constitution. Now the Irish have voted against the Lisbon Treaty again. Every time there is a real substantial test of people's commitment, even in countries where they think Europe is a good thing. The Irish, they're pro the project, but they just thought this was a step too far, and God bless them. So democracy has failed, and one of the reasons that nobody much votes in European elections, the turnout tends to be derisory. It did go up a little bit last time, but only because our government allowed universal postal voting and various other ploys to get people out to vote, is because people recognise that in a general election they can change a government, and they may think that's quite a good thing to do. But they can't change a government in a European election. You can merely change the balance in the shifting alliances and coalitions between a load of political parties that sound like alphabet soup, that you know very little about and really want to know very little about. So where is the excitement in going to vote? I mean, please do go out and vote, and please do, I'm speaking on behalf of the Freedom Association, so I will carefully say, please do vote for Eurosceptic parties. So I hope you will vote, and a few more Eurosceptics will be a bit of an advantage, but you simply can't change the way you're governed or change the direction of the European project by voting. And just very briefly, the third of Dan's points, prosperity, freedom, and security. And you only have to look at the posturing of Europe on the world stage, the attempts to create a separate parallel structure to NATO, not by adding more materiel, more guns and tanks and ships and aircraft. They don't want to spend money on it. No, by separating bits away from NATO and sowing confusion and disheartening the command structure. That's the way they're doing it. And you look at Sarkozy's disastrous little exercise in Georgia. I love John O'Sullivan's comment in the Sunday Times when he said that Sarkozy had designed a peace treaty for Russia through which the Russians were able to drive tank battalions. Loopholes big enough to drive tank battalions. That was the phrase. And then, of course, after about a fortnight, we discovered that it was written originally in French and then translated into English and then translated from English to Russian. And if you read the French version, it said quite clearly that Russian troops would leave all Georgian territory. And if you read the Russian version, it said that Russian troops would not leave Georgian territory. So you can understand that there was scope for confusion. But I personally believe that the reason I haven't been immolated by nuclear weapons or had the country overrun by foreign troops in the last 60 years is because we've been worked tolerably well. And I think we're allowing that to decay at our peril. And part of the process of allowing NATO to decay, in my view, is to the absurd posturing of the European Union in the defence and security area. So I hope you gathered that I personally believe the European Union has outlived its usefulness. I would like to have a free trade agreement in Europe. I would like European foreign ministers to meet periodically and discuss issues of common interest, and perhaps where they all agree to form common policies, perhaps, but again, only on the basis that every single member state wishes to do so, not on the basis that a few apparatchiks in Brussels make the decision and we don't get any more choices. We then come to the areas we were discussing when I came in. What do we do about it? There are those who promote a party or parties which simply wants to leave and makes that a main plank of their platform, and I respect them. There are others who believe that the Conservative Party is capable of doing a job and just needs a bit more of a nudge, and I'm one of them, and I've been working on the case for a long time and intend to continue doing so. What I would say, though, and I think I'd make an appeal here, what I find is that the Eurosceptic movement tends to get frightfully sectarian. I'm having a bit of bother at the moment with a Eurosceptic who believes his best contribution to the cause is to sue just about everybody who has any sort of exchange with him at all. I'm naming no names. And I could mention one or two others who seem to spend more of their time criticising other Eurosceptics. We all have a job to do, we all have a part to play, and people write to me periodically and say, do we need all these separate organisations? And they list 20 organisations that all work. I say, if people are prepared to give their time and their money and their effort and make a noise, it's probably better to have 20 organisations than to have one. It's a bit like, would you like a world government? No, I'd be terrified to death of the world government, especially run by the United Nations. So, let's all keep doing the work that we're doing. And I think we are winning the argument, not least, and I'll conclude on this point, because of the wonderful event that Global Vision and the Daily Telegraph organised. You probably read about it a fortnight ago. We actually had Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the very man, the apotheosis of European integration. And yet he said publicly in London, he said that he recognised that some European countries wish to have full political union, but he knew that there were other countries in the European Union at the moment who did not want to do that. So we had to look at new ways of structuring relationships so that we could all be comfortable together. Well, I'll drink to that. I think we should, and I think it should be something from Britain's point of view that looks much more like a free trade area and much less like a political union. Thank you very much. Well, thanks for mentioning Thomas Jefferson, my hero. He also said, where the people fear the government, there is tyranny. Where the government fears the people, there is freedom. And I think that is something well worth bearing in mind.
Can I just add something to that, which is going back to years ago in the city? In the run-up to 1992, which was talked about in sort of hushed terms as going to be nirvana, in fact people came back from places like the States because they thought it was going to be some big economic explosion, it was all going to be wonderful on the basis of a single European Act and the rest of it. Every single broking house, including the one I work for, produced a book of the effect that 1992 would have on our various sectors. Now, I covered pharmaceuticals and some other bits and bobs. It had no effect whatsoever on the pharmaceutical sector. I thought it would have on the big areas like chemicals, where you shift stuff in tankers and so forth. I thought maybe just. But the leading chemical analyst in the city said no. All of us who told our firm that in fact it would have no effect, which was every single sector, then got hauled up by our head of research, to whom we hardly ever spoke, about once every year or two, but who was pro-EU. And we were all asked to look again, because there must be something in it. So to protect myself, I rang every chief executive of every drug company, the Glaxos and all the rest of them, and said, surely, surely, surely. And they all said, oh, come on, Lindsay, you know jolly well it's not going to have any effect on us. In any case, our markets are in China, growth, Japan, growth, Brazil, growth, somewhere, I'll forget this. And that was it. Absolutely no effect whatsoever.
If I can add, Lindsay, it is now having an effect on the pharmaceutical industry. I have sat with senior executives of major pharmaceutical companies who said, look, we've moved a lot of our physical production of medicines offshore because it's cheaper to do it in other parts of the world, and they're very cheap to fly about. But this was at the very time when Andrew Lansley, and I'm sorry, are you still recording this? I shouldn't be criticising my Conservative colleagues, but Andrew Lansley was saying, look, the European Union is such a, this was in his leadership campaign, the European Union is such a wonderful thing, we need the scope and the scale of the European Union to persuade the big drug companies that it's worth doing research here. The previous day after, before I read that, I'd been talking to the people who've been saying, we've moved our production offshore like this, we're going to move our R&D